A groundskeeper mowing a war memorial flinches every time a name is read from its wall, and no one has ever asked him why. Marissa Pennington did not ask that morning either. She stood at the edge of the assembling rehearsal crowd with her printed run sheet folded lengthwise in one hand and told Colton Blake, loud enough to carry, that she wanted the groundskeeper and his mower off the lawn before the general's motorcade arrived. She did not lower her voice. She did not check who stood close enough to hear himself discussed like a piece of equipment that had wandered onto the wrong film set. $90,000 in annual foundation funding rode on the next 3 hours, going exactly as scripted. The motorcade was due at 11, and 40 yards away, cutting a line he had cut every week for 6 years without pay, a 78-year-old man kept mowing, because in 24 years of service to his country and 35 since, Foster Lathrop had learned there were insults worth answering and insults worth simply outliving. If you've ever driven past a groundskeeper and never once wondered whose war he carried, this next part is for you. He came every Saturday at 7 before the dew burned off, in a denim barn coat gone soft and colorless at the cuffs, buttoned to the throat no matter the weather, because a body his age chilled quicker than it used to, and he had never seen the use in pretending otherwise. He walked the mower in long straight passes, the engine's drone settling into the kind of hum that made the crows in the sycamores stop bothering to notice him. When he reached the stone border that ringed the memorial's inner court, he cut the engine, knelt with the particular care of a man whose right shoulder would not rise past his own chest anymore, and turned his whole body sideways rather than reach across himself for the tool clipped to his belt. It was a hand-forged steel-grade stake, stamped along its shaft with the unit numbers of an engineer battalion that had not existed in 35 years, and he pressed it flat against the granite lip and sighted down its edge the way he had once sighted down a transit level over moving water, 1/8 of an inch. That was the tolerance he held the cutting line to against the border stone, a measurement nobody in the county had ever asked him to keep, and nobody but Foster Lathrop would have noticed if he hadn't. Colton Blake, 6 months into the job and still learning which silences meant something, watched from the equipment shed with a rake he had forgotten he was holding. He had clocked the flag first, a marker 2 rows in from the border, the name on it worn soft from weather, a small metal flag canted a few degrees off true in yesterday's wind. Foster set his stake down, walked to the marker, and with 2 fingers alone straightened the flag to plumb, sighting it the same unhurried way he'd sighted the stone. He did not speak to it. He did not linger unusually long, but Colton had grown up around men who fixed things without being asked, and he understood, without yet knowing why, that this was not maintenance. This was an appointment Foster kept with someone who could no longer keep it with him. "That flag get knocked around a lot?" Colton finally asked when Foster wheeled the mower past the shed. "Wind does what wind does," Foster said, and kept walking, his shoulder held low and still, the whole of him turning rather than reaching, the way a man learns to move around an old injury until the accommodation looks, to a stranger, like nothing more than habit. Marissa found him 20 minutes later at the north bed, run sheet in hand, ink pen capped and clipped to its top corner like a rank insignia. "Sir, I need you to stop the mower." She said it the way she said most things that morning, flat and procedural, a woman reciting from a document only she could see. Per the accepted roster for today's rehearsal, grounds access is restricted to ceremony personnel starting at 8. That's policy. I don't have a name for you on my list. Foster throttled down but did not cut the engine. Been mowing this lawn a long while before there was a list. I understand that's been the arrangement. She glanced at the gathering crowd, aware now of an audience, and her voice found its performing register, pitched for the folding chairs filling in behind her. But today isn't a regular Saturday. We have a 2-star general arriving in 3 hours, a donor delegation photographing every square foot of this lawn, and I cannot have an unauthorized mower running through a live sound check. She turned to Colton. "Get a photo of the equipment for the incident log. Sir, I'll need you to move it off the grounds until after the ceremony." The rehearsal crowd had gone quiet in that particular way. Crowds go quiet when they sense someone is about to be embarrassed in public and would rather not watch, but cannot look away either. Colton lifted his phone, thumb hovering, and did not press the shutter right away. Foster looked at the camera, then at Marissa, then down at his own hands on the mower handle, weighing, the way he weighed most things, whether this was a fight worth having before 11 o'clock. He cut the engine himself. The silence that followed had a shape to it, wide and awkward, and into it he said only, "I'll clear the grass. I won't clear the border," and walked toward the equipment shed for a hand edger, leaving the mower where it sat, its idle still ticking down. He worked the border by hand after that, on his knees on a foam pad he kept folded in the shed, running the manual edger along the granite lip in passes no less exact than the mower's had been, while behind him Marissa began her sound check, script in hand, voice lifted for the microphone technician to level. She read through the order of program, the invocation, the flag detail, and then, because the day's centerpiece was a public reading of the memorial's honored names, she began the roster. Colton, coiling a cable a few feet off, watched Foster's hands go still on the edger at a name 3 lines down. Not the name of anyone famous, not a name that meant anything to Colton at all, just a name read aloud in a stranger's rehearsing voice, and Foster's whole body held for a second the way a man holds still when a truck backfires nearby, and he is deciding whether it was only a truck. Then his hands moved again, and the moment passed so quickly Colton might have invented it, except that he had seen enough of Foster's stillnesses by now to know this one was different in kind. "Motorcade's confirmed for 11 sharp. A staffer called from the tent, checking a phone. "Escort says they're already past the county line." Marissa nodded without looking up from her script, marked something in ink, and kept reading. 3 hours had become 2 hours and 40 minutes, and the list of names went on. She reached the memorial's newer section near the top of the 3rd rehearsal pass, the panel re-engraved that spring as part of her own rededication project, granite so fresh it still smelled faintly of stone dust when the sun warmed it. She read the names in order, evenly, the practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed grief into a manageable rhythm. Then she stumbled. "Foster." She stopped, frowned at the page as if the print had rearranged itself, and looked again. "Foster Lathrop." She said it a second time, softer, checking it against some internal ledger of things that could not both be true. The name sat among the honored fallen, cut clean and recent into stone, reserved for men who did not come back, and she said it a third time only because saying it seemed to be the only way to test whether the world would correct her. It did not correct her. Instead, the edger stopped scraping behind her, and when she turned, Foster was standing at the border with the tool loose in his hand and the mower idling 40 feet away, exactly as named, exactly as alive as anyone standing on that lawn. Watching her read his own death off a wall he had trued to 1/8 of an inch every week for 6 years, without once explaining why. The county attorney arrived within the hour, a lean, unhurried woman named Priscilla Fenno, who had handled the memorial's easements for a decade and looked, Colton thought, entirely unsurprised to be handling something worse. She spread the engraver's invoice across a folding table under the tent, next to Marissa's run sheet, and traced a finger down the paperwork trail with the patience of someone who had seen bureaucracies bury themselves before. The re-engraving order authorizing the fresh panel, the one Marissa herself had signed off on months ago as part of the rededication, had been processed against a roster template dated from a War Department form retired in the mid-1990s, a form whose verification chain, Fenno said, no longer satisfied the county's own record standards. Every name on that panel, not only Foster's, now sat on legally unstable ground 3 days before a decade-long funding agreement was set to be signed in front of it. "So the whole wall's in question," Marissa said, not a question. "The whole wall's in question," Fenno confirmed, "until somebody tells me which version of history we're carving into stone this time." It was in the gap after that, while Fenno made calls and Colton kept the crowd occupied with sound levels nobody needed leveled, that a man in a blazer too crisp for the grass introduced himself as Warren Etheridge, Foundation Liaison for the donor family, whose name anchored the ceremony's largest gift. He drew Marissa aside near the flagpole, voice pitched low and reasonable, the voice of a man who believed reasonableness was the same thing as being right. "Nobody's asking you to rewrite history today," he said. "Add a footnote. Note the discrepancy. Commit to a full review after the funding's signed. The family has been generous for 3 decades, Ms. Pennington. They don't need to watch their name qualified in front of a general and a camera crew because of a clerical question from before either of us worked here." "It isn't a clerical question if a living man is engraved as dead," Marissa said. It's a clerical question until you decide it isn't, Etheridge said, and smiled in the way men smile when they have already budgeted for the possibility of losing an argument and are only testing whether they have to. She did not answer him. She looked instead across the lawn at Foster, back on his knees at the border, working the edger in long, patient strokes as though nothing on that panel concerned him at all. And for the first time that morning, she found she could not finish reading her own run sheet without her hand drifting to the line where his name did not belong. Word of the discrepancy reached Foster by way of Colton, who found him repacking the foam pad into the shed with the same unhurried economy he did everything else, and told him, because it seemed wrong not to, that the funding might not survive a public correction. Foster listened without stopping his hands. "Then leave the name wrong," he said. 6 months of some fool's paperwork isn't worth a program folding over an old man's vanity. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, and turned to carry the pad out to his truck, his shoulder held at its permanent low angle, a man closing an account before it could cost anyone else anything. He did not get as far as the truck. A dark sedan came up the access road ahead of the announced motorcade, 40 minutes early, and from it stepped a man of 81 in a service-dress jacket hung with more ribbon than Colton had ever seen on a living chest, moving with the deliberate, unassisted pride of someone who had trained his own body for decades not to need help crossing open ground. He crossed the lawn directly, past the tent, past Marissa, past the folding table with its unstable invoice, and stopped in front of the old man holding a foam kneeling pad. "Lathrop," General Marion Waddell said. Not a question, not a greeting. A confirmation, the way a man reads a coordinate off a map he has carried in his head for 45 years and finds it at last matching the ground beneath his boots. Foster set the pad down. "General, I have had 4 investigators and 1 very expensive retirement hobby looking for you since the year I pinned my 2nd star," Waddell said, "and you have been mowing this grass under my nose the entire time." He turned then to Marissa, to Etheridge, to the rehearsal crowd drifting closer now that stillness itself had become the most interesting thing on the lawn, and his voice lost its private register and found the one that had once carried over river noise and diesel engines. 32 years ago, someone in this office's founding administration ordered a name struck from that wall and another set in its place to keep a checkbook comfortable. I don't know that man's rank. I know his title. Deputy Director Ainsworth signed the order himself, and Deputy Director Ainsworth is not here to answer for it because men who make that kind of decision rarely are. He let that sit. The family funding your ceremony today, Ms. Pennington, is the same family whose comfort he was protecting. You did not do this. But you are the one standing here when the bill comes due, and I'd rather you heard the truth from me than read it off a footnote." Marissa said nothing for a long moment. The crowd's silence pressing in around her louder than any objection could have. Colton watching her the way he'd watched Foster all morning. For the tell, the flinch. The thing a stillness reveals if you wait long enough. When she finally spoke, it was not to Waddell. It was to Etheridge, 3 feet away, his reasonable smile gone entirely still on his face. "I'm reading the corrected roster at 11, she said. "You can tell the board whatever you need to tell them." The crowd that had gathered for a rehearsal stood now for something closer to a confession, and General Waddell did not wait for anyone's permission to give it. He stood at the podium, meant for 11 o'clock, 40 minutes early, microphone still warm from the sound check, and told them of a river crossing 45 years gone, 2 companies, a pontoon bridge buckling under a weight it was never rated to carry, and 1 engineer sergeant who had stayed on the span alone, bracing a failing joint with his own back, and a jack he had no business trusting, long enough for every man behind him to reach the far bank before the whole structure gave way into the current. "I was a lieutenant on that bridge," Waddell said. "I have carried his name in every after-action report I ever filed, and I could never find the man who owned it, because somewhere along the way, somebody decided his name suited a stone better than his life did." Marissa stepped to the podium when he finished, run sheet abandoned on the folding table behind her, and read the roster not from her printed sheet, but from the corrected list Fenno had drafted an hour before. Foster's name removed from the honored fallen, restored instead to a program still very much among the living, each name that followed read at the same unhurried pace, as if she had finally understood that a roster was not a schedule to be gotten through, but a set of debts to be paid out loud. The crowd that had gone quiet for General Waddle went quieter still for her, and somewhere in that quiet, Colton understood he had witnessed the exact shape of a conversion, not an apology, but a woman choosing the harder true thing over the easier comfortable one in front of the very people whose comfort she'd been hired to protect. Foster stood at the back of the crowd through all of it, coat buttoned to the throat, and when Waddell gestured him forward, he came only as far as duty required and no farther, refusing the podium itself with a small shake of his head. "Don't need the stone fixed for me," he said, voice pitched for the front rows only, plain and load-bearing as a beam. "Fix the 1-2 rows down. Corporal Emmett Sowell, my wife's brother. Been spelled wrong 32 years. An extra L nobody ever caught because nobody ever read it slow enough." He did not explain further. He did not need to. Marissa was already writing the name down, and this time she did not check it against any policy at all. Months later, the panel stood corrected in full. Foster's name struck from the register of the fallen and entered instead into a bronze plate near the entrance, honoring living veterans who still served the grounds. Emmett Sowell's name recut without its error, and beside both, a small new line that read only, in the plain language institutions use when they have finally learned to be plain, "Roster accuracy reviewed annually." Colton Blake ran that review now, clipboard traded for a proper binder, cross-checking names against original service files instead of whatever paperwork happened to be nearest at hand. The funding had been renewed, on terms that included an independent verification clause the donor family had, in the end, signed without complaint. Etheridge's reasonable voice nowhere in evidence at the signing. Marissa still carried a run sheet to every event, but she had stopped hiding behind it. She greeted the veterans who came through the gate by name now, most of them learned before they arrived. And when she did not know a name, she asked for it plainly and wrote it down herself, rather than checking it against an accepted list. The ceremony crowd was long gone on the afternoon Foster returned to the border alone. Mower parked and silent behind him, its engine ticked out and cooling in the low autumn light. He knelt at Emmett Sowell's marker the way he always had, the way his shoulder allowed and no other way, and straightened the small flag there to true vertical with 2 fingers, sighting it against the stone the way he had once sighted a transit line over moving water. He did not do this for the mowing. He had never done it for the mowing. He trued the border and the flag and the 1/8-inch line because it was the last flat level thing left in the world that a man his age could still make right with his own 2 hands, and because Adele had loved her brother enough that somebody ought to keep him standing straight, even now, even this late, even after everyone else had stopped looking. Some names get engraved twice before anyone reads them once. Tell us the name you'd finally read aloud. He rose, slow, favoring the shoulder, and looked once at the border he had trued for 6 years without pay and without asking anyone's permission, then walked back toward the shed, leaving the mower where it stood, silent, and the flag behind him standing straight.